Um, so my general comment on the second reading is, oh my God, why did I ever choose this book for my meaning of life class? I am now having tremendous anxiety and despair over what's going to happen next week when we try to read the first 42 pages of this book. So that's my initial reaction. It's like, ah! You know, several, and I mean, that class, we've got people like Hunter and Matthew Squires who know entirely too much philosophy. And then we've got people for whom this is the second philosophy class they have ever had, you know, and they're reading things like, a human being is spirit, but what is spirit? Spirit is the self, but what is the self? A self is a relation that relates itself to itself, or is the relations relating itself to itself in the relation, you know, so anyway. And, but I don't really have any place to start in today's reading. I think I understood the second part better than the first, you know, the one that looked at despair from, although we're not finished with it because I cut it off in the middle, but despair defined by consciousness. I mean, I have sort of an abstract sense of what he's talking about. You know, despair considered dialectically, I guess you could say. But maybe that's okay because that is supposed to be abstract, more abstract. But what I keep trying to do is come up with examples, like when he says, okay, so here's what infinitude's despair is, to lack infinitude, and here's what it's like. And I keep trying to think up examples, like, you know, what kind of condition would this look like? Maybe that's a mistake, because maybe I should only be looking for examples in the section where he's talking about despair defined by consciousness, you know, how it appears in consciousness. So anyway, that would be, you know, again, part of my reasoning here is, you know, maybe you guys can help me come up with some examples to explain some of this stuff, but I don't know, you know, what, I guess I wonder, can you really give examples for that first part where he's looking at it dialectically as this relation between finitude and infinitude and so on. And another question that I kind of have a vague sense of what he means, but another big question is I have in the second part is, he's defining the degrees of consciousness. And that's just an odd phrase, you know, degrees of consciousness, like degrees of self-awareness or intensity of self-awareness or what. So anyway, those are some of my questions.
Just before we answer your questions, in concern to your class, I told you last time that I got the essential Kierkegaard from the Hongs, and for their sickness unto death, they cut out a large part of the reading that was due today because I thought, that was really quick. So, I don't have to answer your question. Never mind then. But anyway, just a thought was that the Hongs have no part of that C section that we went over because I did the reading in like 10 minutes and I'm like, that was quick, right, wrong. So I had to go online. So that was just a thought.
Sounds like the despair of necessity. But yeah, it works. Yeah, so I didn't actually finish the reading because I'm a bad person. I don't know what kind of despair that is exactly. I don't know, probably all of them. But yeah, I think I was able to think of examples from people that I know for the different categories of despair. Like some of them just like immediately jumped out at me, the examples of people I know based on the descriptions, like, oh my God, that's my cousin. Like my cousin, bourgeoisie, what is it, Philistine? Yeah, probability, statistics. There's just like examples like that. So it's kind of hard to point out people I think that we would all know as examples, because this is, it's fundamentally about selves, about people. So I think it's kind of hard to think of an example in that sense that I could, you know, maybe I could like explain my cousin to everyone here, but that would be kind of ridiculous. So you kind of have to go by his sort of abstract descriptions in a sense. But as far as the degrees of consciousness, so that's the section I was just reading at the very end, but I think it is something like intensity that he's talking about, like a kind of intensity of reflection on oneself, I guess. Yeah, so I can't remember I think that was all the questions. I don't know. That's my attempt to answer. I have to answer your questions. I'm always, yeah. If somebody asks a question, I feel like I have to answer it for some reason, unless I absolutely don't know anything, which sometimes it happens. A lot of time, actually.
Hunter will give us the answers. He's here. You know, this.
Whatever it is that you've conscripted me into, the answer is yes. I'm here. I'm finally here. Don't worry, everybody. I made it.
You know, frankly, I mean, I've read this several times and I still have a very hard time figuring out what he's talking about. But I had a little epiphany. I mean, maybe my epiphanies are things that I just should have figured out the very first time. But one of them is almost at the end on page 51. The first sentence of the first full paragraph. The man of immediacy is only psychically qualified insofar as there really can be immediacy without reflection at all. And then he goes on, but you know, I just have a lot of trouble with all this vocabulary, you know, immediacy, dialectic, mediation, you know, and because he used, you know, Hegel uses some of these words, but then it's not clear Descartes means the same thing Hegel does. Sometimes he may mean something completely different. Sometimes he may mean the opposite of Hegel. So like mediation is a big thing, but I'm never quite sure what he means by that. And then I try to plug immediacy into some relation to mediation. But if you know, maybe, you know, again, I don't know, but here in that sentence, when he says, insofar as there can really be any immediacy without any reflection at all. And then later on, you know, I only had us read those 2 pages, that page and the next one, but he talks about it, you know, this person, it sounds to me like he's just kind of going on about his life, doing his thing, not really paying any attention to what's happened, you know, to the meaning or value of anything he does. He's just kind of living life, playing with his toys, you know, going to work, having parties, everything's great. And then this stroke of fate occurs, you know, which just messes up his life. And it suddenly shocks him into asking these big questions. And then when the crisis is over, you know, he says his immediacy is dealt a crushing blow. It cannot reproduce itself. He despairs. But then, you know, when the crisis is over, he just kind of goes back to bopping along and doing the life thing, and everything's fine. And so that made me think that, you know, because I was trying to, and maybe it still does, immediacy maybe relates to, you know, one of these more profound philosophical concepts. But there, it just sounds to me like immediacy as opposed to reflection. In other words, immediacy as in just kind of living your life in this immediate way without reflection. You know, you're not really thinking about or reflecting on or considering, you know, your relation to God, or, you know, your ethical decisions or the meaning of what you're doing or anything else. It's just kind of this way of living unconsciously in a way. And so I'm just struggling for ways to understand again what he means by degrees of consciousness and immediacy. And this is in this section where he's talking about kind of living, I think, in sort of an unconscious way. And anyway, I'm just thinking maybe that's what he means, is just kind of living without any kind of reflection or meditation on what this whole thing is about.
Wait, oh gosh, that's what I bet I sounded really far away a second ago, is because my microphone was, sorry, I sounded like I was like in the sewer or something. Like, okay, but now it's all good. It should sound much better. Okay, so now that I'm here, I'm gonna use my typical privileged attitude to assume that I have some right to all of your attention. So, okay, let's do it. Just to talk, like, at least Nevitt, I have a right to Nevitt and his attention. But I basically, Nevitt, just to kind of, and this is just my reading, and I want to kind of, yeah, thank you, Sean. I kind of want to keep building on this line of thought, because I don't have like a definitive, like, Hegel man is here. I've come to save the day. I've got the answer. Yeah, I know, Travis. Yeah, can't believe it, right? So I don't have like the answer or anything, but I do have, like, I just have thoughts that are similar to yours, Nevitt, but that come from a slightly different place. And let's talk about it a little bit. Okay, so I'm also peeling a sticker off of something while I'm talking, so that's kind of devouring my consciousness. But so I'm going to put that down. So basically, I think that the immediacy, there's a part that he talks about immediacy in a really interesting way on the page that you talked about. The on page 81 of the, or no, it's not page 81 for you people, just for Travis and I. Travis and I have the Penguin Classics edition of Fear and Trembling with the fun little painting on the front. Yes. So you perspiring Philistines will have to keep up. But Travis and I have uniform pagination. On the page that says the despair is mere passivity, a succumbing to external pressure. With the pages with the gigantic footnotes about femininity and masculinity, which, by the way, was awesome. I really like. I disagree with some stuff Kierkegaard said about that, but I think it's really cool, and he's leading some interesting discussions. But on the page with the big footnotes about women and men, women be shopping or whatever it is he's saying, and those big sweeping, remarks about femininity and masculinity, there's a passage, and I don't know how to refer to it for everybody that's not using the Penguin Classics version, but I just want to refer to a specific sentence at the beginning of the paragraph that says, the immediate person, and then in parentheses, insofar as immediacy can occur entirely without reflection. So starting there, he says, the immediate person, insofar as immediacy can occur entirely without reflection, is specifiable only as soul. And I really bracketed that. I was like, whoa, his self and he himself, a something included in the scope of the temporal and the worldly, in immediate continuity with to heteron, the other, and it presents only an illusory appearance of having something eternal in it. So I think that when he's talking about immediacy, like, I want to just localize this within the section. Like, this is in the section that's talking about the despair, which is conscious of being despair, which is therefore conscious of having self, in which there is, however, something eternal, and which now, either in despair does not want to be itself, or in despair wants to be itself. That's the section header. And then it's a subsection where we start this, where he says, 1, despair over the earthly or over something earthly. And so he's talking about an individual who recognizes that, thank you, Chase, thank you very much. It's on page 51 for everybody. He's recognizing that there's a notion of despair within the experience of earthly minded people, or of common sense, salt of the earth sort of attitudes. There is an attachment to the world and to the earth and to the people around you. And within those relationships, there is a potency for despair. There is this potentiality for despair, or despair, for Kierkegaard to be despair in quotes. I think this description of the individual who has come into contact with some sort of despair or whatever, and this talk about soul, it kind of confuses the discussion, because he's very clear at the beginning of Despair Over the Earthly or Over Something Earthly. The very first sentence is, "This is pure immediacy," or immediacy with some quantitative reflection. Here, there is no infinite consciousness of the self, of what despair is, or of the states being one of despair. So it's just it's an experience, or I guess just it is an example of the relation that he talked about at the beginning. Each individual is this relation relating to itself and whatever. So he's describing an instance of this relation relating to itself or whatever, in its relating, in its sort of, infinite swings, like this pendulum back and forth between total doubt and total faith and whatever. Or I guess this synthesis between the finite and the infinite. I think that he's really trying to agreeing with what you said, Nevitt, just trying to put a magnifying glass on the type of person that is totally disconnected from infinity, from the infinite, and that includes his previous discussions over the despair of finitude. If we want a real elaborate look at what this immediate person is like, then I think that we can get clues from it by going back and looking at what he said about finitude's despair. The despair of finitude includes all of these different elaborations or examples of the types of people that are these earthly, common sense, salt of the earth folks. They either are craven and desirous of things and these sort of giving into temptation sort of personalities, or perhaps they're virtuous. Perhaps they're extremely virtuous and they're really skilled at what they do and they're really smart and handsome and everybody likes them. and they're really successful spirits in the world, but he argues that still can leave them either completely like aloof or I suppose unaware of their despair, right? Or they can put them into this situation that we're describing right here. Now we're here. I think that the despair that he's talking about, because he says it a couple times, it is a faux despair. It is like a pseudo despair. It is, and in fact, he says that it is due, if you will, to an innocent misuse of language, a play on words, rather as when children play at being soldiers, that words such as self and despair occur in the language of immediacy. And if I can kind of get into some actual like formal philosophy here, I think his notion of the immediate person, yes, Nevitt, I think you and I have like the same idea you and I have the same idea, Nevitt, of this perspective that Kierkegaard is taking over people that have this lack of philosophical insight or philosophical reflection or connection to the infinite. That's what he would describe it as. He would say all of this philosophical insight and personal reflection, that's a connection or a relationship to the infinite. And he says that a lack of a connection or relationship to the infinite makes a thing finite. And that finite thing is an experience of immediacy. Yeah. And this like immediate man that he's describing, the immediate man is attached to worldly pleasures and is in what he thinks is despair, like a child when he realizes that his toys are broken. But I think that the reason that if we want to talk about Hegel now, Hegel uses immediacy in a much different way. And this is, I think now we're getting to the vocab and we can like actually kind of just start figuring out what he's saying. Because when Hegel says immediacy, he is referring to a complex concept, which is a thing that is sort of like Lacan's notion of the impossible real thing, which I don't know if we've discussed before, but I believe that Lacan is sort of like a lever that we can use to kind of crank the Hegel machine to make it work. Because if we try to get in on Hegel on his terms, he purposefully makes it difficult to understand what he's saying. And so Lacan comes in and makes it readable. There's this impossible real thing that is certainty, and that is sexuality, that is knowledge, It's reality in itself, sort of like Kant's noumenal. There's this impossible real thing, and one of those impossible real things is immediacy. And an example of kind of how we get to that immediacy yeah, for Hegel, the way that we get to that immediacy is we can't. We are permanently mediated. That's why people call Hegel the philosopher of mediation. He says that everything is mediated. He says that all of our relationships to objects and to the world is completely mediated by concepts. I have a concept of what a screen is, which is why I'm looking at you people. I have a concept of what you people are, and I have a concept of all these things that make the world make sense. And so Hegel would say that we're never really immediate. Hegel would say these people aren't immediate, they're just foolish. Like Kierkegaard, these people aren't like immediate. They're just kind of uneducated or whatever, and that's fine. But they're not like these immediate immanent consciousnesses that are like they just took a whippet or something and they're just absorbing all of the phenomena in front of them with a one-to-one interaction from the thing to its brain. There's just this that's how Hegel would describe immediacy. And he says the only way that we can get through that or get to that is in a roundabout way. It's by mediating mediation, by mediating mediation itself so far that mediation disappears. It's a manual sort of internally contradictory, sort of like pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps. Hegel says that we have to do that. We have to pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps in the sense that we have to mediate our mediation until it reaches or can be conceived of as something like immediacy. But for Kierkegaard, I think that he's willing to say that these people are immediate for a reason. He's not just saying, oh, Hegel said immediate, that sounds good. I think that his notion of the immediate is different. Hegel's notion of the immediate is that weird sort of impossible real thing that we kind of circle around through our mediation, right? Yeah, I know. But for Kierkegaard, immediate is not so impossible to achieve. It's I think Kierkegaard, there's a differing point in a move. There's a move that's made in the Hegelian dialectic that Kierkegaard puts at a different place in the equation. I think that Kierkegaard would describe his leap of faith, his notion of the leap of faith as this an act that has to be embodied by the individual in full consciousness and despair. Like I have totally given up that the maiden will love me. And then, but God exists, so who, anything can happen, so I believe in, so then I consciously, with all of my reflection on my absolute finitude and lack and how trapped I am and how ugly I am and whatever, I then make a full move with my whole spirit towards this what Kierkegaard would call a move constitutive of spirit itself, the leap of faith. I think that Kierkegaard is arguing here that this leap of faith or this relationship to infinity, and you can make a leap of faith anywhere. If you're a little kid and you say, my crayon is broken and I'm sad, and then because you're a stupid little idiot, you open up the crayon box thinking, well, maybe there's another crayon of the same kind, or maybe the same crayon will be in there, or there's just some blind hope that the thing will still happen in faith and trust in the absurd. I think that Kierkegaard would say, yeah, that's a moment of a leap of faith. He'd say, yeah, little kids do leaps of faith all the time when they just do things that they don't know about. And I don't know, it probably will work out. Or at least a notion of things working out in a sort of cohesive way, despite all reasonable doubt or belief, or like, if all of my reason tells me one thing, all of my reasoning capacity, my crayon is broken and I can't use it anymore. I then have this faith, this either from stupidity or from losing my mind. He describes the leap of faith as losing your mind. I open up the crayon box with God in my heart, hoping to find the return, the thing that is impossible, the impossible made possible. If if you have ever conceived of a thing that you reason out as being impossible and you conceive of it as potentially being possible again, you've made a leap of faith. And Kierkegaard would say that we do that. We do that in our interaction with the with the world and with our problems and our despair and ourself. We make these leaps of faith. But I think that Kierkegaard here is describing an individual that has distanced themselves from this leap of faith. Perhaps they've taken leaps of faith before, but they're not, thinking about it. They're not, ruminating on the fact that they took a leap of faith. You can take a leap of faith without really being aware that you took a leap of faith. And then your day can go on and be like, oh, I was kind of stupid for a second, whatever. Back to my day job, it's just, or whatever, back to stupid, miserable reality. I think that Kierkegaard would argue that these leaps of faith can like occur in these sort of random contingent jumping points in the experience of the relation as it relates to itself and the things that ground it. There's this sort of explosive potentiality within the relation to shoot off and to experience a leap of faith, or to suddenly become transparent and then rest in the arms of the thing that grounds it, or to become like a demon in a way with demonic despair. There's this contingency in the existence or in the fate of the spirit or of the relation. And I think that Hegel would say, no, there's that leap of faith that happens the very moment that you start thinking, that you start conceptualizing. You are already in the leap of faith. You have committed the leap of faith. You've done the Entschluss, the resolve. It's at the beginning of all thought. Sorry, pal, you already did it. You're good. You're in the clear now. And yet you're still kind of in tatters. Because that's not the whole story. But Kierkegaard would say that no, it's this important event that has to be kind of consciously enacted and synthesized. Literally synthesized by the synthesis. That was just fun. But basically my point is that for Hegel, no person is immediate, because we already took the leap of faith as soon as we started. As soon as we started the equation, like this whole life business, started thinking, whatever we want to call thinking, as soon as we start thinking, we've already taken the leap of faith. And therefore, we are no longer immediate for Hegel. And the only way for Hegel to get back to the immediate is to do this roundabout, weird sort of mental game of mediation. That's the only way to do it for Hegel. But for Kierkegaard, there's this interplay between mediation and immediacy. Sometimes I'm immediate, sometimes I'm mediated. There are certain people, and Kierkegaard might call himself one of these, who become mediated and recognize the infinite and can never let it leave them. They can never return to simple, humble, podunk life. They're totally alienated and in anxiety, in this state of constant anxiety. And he would say, yeah, I'm not experiencing life immediately. I'm not in a state of immediacy. But he would say that there are certain people or certain relationships to God, I'm going to call like spirits or souls or whatever, that can commit to a sort of immediacy through a detachment, through like a real, like solid break or detachment from leaps of faith and faith in the absurd or connection to the infinite at all. And that's what you get. That's what you have when you talk to somebody who says, I just believe in common sense and reason and logic and Ben Shapiro and like just like binary, like, it's the rules of the life, you got to get with it. This is just the way the world works. And there's just no two ways about it. I think that Kierkegaard would say, yeah, you're experiencing life in a sort of immediate way. You are not experiencing the world mediated by this infinite consciousness, this consciousness of infinity. And then he even clarifies that immediacy is not just pure immediacy, but also immediacy with some quantitative reflection. Quantitative reflection in the sense that, yeah, you can think about like how to get money big and like how to, do good at work, and like you can think about like why you're such a bad husband or whatever. And that's something. That's reflective, but that's not reconciling one's connection to the infinite and attempting to free oneself from despair, real despair. And this whole chapter, or this discussion about despair and the earthly and stuff, he says this is just all a bunch of confusion in the hands of the confused, I think. That was a lot. I did not mean to I'm just gabbing. So yeah.
Yeah, my basically everything I write inevitably is like half ironic, where I don't even know if I'm serious or not. That's how alienated I am from myself, I guess. I think Kierkegaard would probably say that. But yeah, so the part about the concrete that Kierkegaard talks about at the beginning makes it seem like, okay, so that's something. He talks about this synthesis, which is, the relation relating to itself that really comes to know itself as itself, which is that it's a relation. So it's hard not to fall into Kierkegaard's like hilarious language where it sounds like gibberish because he's talking about a relation relating to itself. But the concrete is that because it's a synthesis between these, two opposites, therefore it's something that's very difficult to attain. And I think that's why it's something that I think Hunter described as, or at least immediacy for Hegel, as something that's very difficult to actually get towards. You're constantly almost like elliptically like going around it because we're, in this constant balance between these two opposite points of tension with this polarity and whatnot. But there's a lot of interesting stuff at the very beginning where he's talking about the self as the progress of the becoming. So he makes this point that this is a process and it's becoming, and that it's also something where there's, the infinite that's moving away from itself, and then the finite that's coming back towards this kind of actuality. But they have this kind of inherent paradoxical nature to them that keeps it where you can't just zoom in on one of these movements. It has to be some kind of paradoxical synthesis of these two opposite movements. And I think that's why it's so, first of all, difficult to explain, because by, I guess, like a very, linear formal logic, it's a contradiction to say, you are the infinite and the finite. But yet that's exactly what's going on. And it makes sense if you think about it in terms of becoming and in process. Otherwise, if you think of it in these static terms, it makes no sense at all. So I think in a lot of ways, that's what he's trying to get us to see, is this kind of nuance when you think of the self as something that is a process. It's something that's very nuanced. Yeah, so I think I'll leave it there and see what people think of that.
Want to note that Sean is being polite and raised his hand.
It's fine. I kind of just was allowing people to talk because I was kind of curious to see where people were going, and in particular, I think it was good that both Hunter and Chase got to speak before me. I guess I'm trying to think of, because a lot of what Hunter said made sense, but I do think that there were aspects of it that like intuitively, or maybe just based on what I remember about Kierkegaard, I don't think quite mess with his view. But like I'm having trouble like sticking my finger on what exactly I think you're misunderstanding with him. One of the maybe like an analogy that might be helpful for people, I don't know if you already understand this, then this probably isn't very helpful, is I think the reason why Kierkegaard is saying there has to be at least some degree of non-immediacy, even in these very immediate examples of individuals, is because if human beings have to, like, in order to be a self, right, in order to be one of those things, there has to be both this immediate, like, or this finite and infinite component, right? In order to have immediacy as a thought, as an entity that is acting in the world and behaving, there has to be a degree of infinitude. It could be reduced down hypothetically, like infinitely, like you could have smaller and smaller degrees of infinitude present, giving the thought structure to this. So I think Kierkegaard can basically just say, yeah, no, there are no examples of a purely finite individual, because a purely finite individual is not an individual. It's just not. It doesn't have the properties that we would attribute to an individual. So all you can do is try to drive that down. And I am almost sort of like, so the way I've been imagining it is like a water balloon, basically. And it's like you can kind of push the water out of one end onto another end, or do it the opposite way around, and you can kind of like try to focus on one aspect of the thing. But ultimately, like you can't make it all in one end without breaking the balloon and having the water go everywhere, right? There has to be this kind of thing. And so I think in terms of Hunter's description of immediacy, or maybe I was misinterpreting you, but immediacy as Kierkegaard's conception of what it means to be a believer, right? I'm having a little bit of trouble. Like, I think I get your presentation of Hegel there, but I don't know if I understand how this applies to Kierkegaard, because it seems to me Kierkegaard would want to say simultaneously that a believer has to have, like, if you just have the faith in God in a particular moment, it's not really faith in God, according to Kierkegaard. Like, it can't be. It isn't the thing, right? At the same time, right? It has to be totally constitutive of everything, right? It has to touch every aspect of your being, at least going forward. At the same time, right, it also has to be this mix of the infinite potential of God with the immediacy of the particular situation. And how exactly the believer reconciles that, I think, is a little bit interesting, right? Because I'm not 100% sure on how Kierkegaard is understanding that. But it does seem to me that it has to be something about how, not just that God can fulfill my immediate desires, but also the recognition that my desires, my existence as an entity that is the relation of the blah 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 between an infinite and a finite aspect. Like, I have to understand myself as participating in the overarching thing that is God and God's plan and God's conception of me and God's relationship with everyone else, right? And I do think that this is, I would bring this forward as like a critique I have of Kierkegaard, is even though I think that's something that he has to do, right? Like, he has to not just talk about what this means for the individual, but we have to talk about, but also how the individual relates to God, and how God then relates to other individuals, and we have to think about it at that mass scale. But I don't see that analysis in Kierkegaard, and I don't remember it being there either back when I kind of half-heartedly read bits of this a long time ago. It is interesting to me. So we were talking about how there's the section where he's talking about femininity and masculinity and blah 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 blah. And one thing that's interesting about that section that I think a lot of us would disagree with, but it's there, is he does have the statement that women can't have the direct relationship with God, or at least they probably usually won't, but they'll have it in like this deferred way where they experience it through being committed to their husband, presumably. Or, I mean, this is Kierkegaard, so maybe to their lover, I don't know. But whoever it is that they're committed to, they're getting it in this like deferred way. And I think that's interesting because I have no idea how Kierkegaard reconciles that with the rest of his conceptualization of how this works. Like, so you're saying like 50% of the population just can't interface with God directly, but if you're going to be a complete person, you have to have that interface, but they're having to do it then deferredly through another person. But then what does that look like? How does that function? and I mean, maybe he goes on to explain this somewhere else, because again, I don't even know like how much of this I ever read. But it is interesting to me that there is this like radically individualist element, even as Kierkegaard is being, you know, critical of like, I mean, I know he probably doesn't mean the same thing as Marx here, but like, you know, he's been critical of like bourgeois tendencies and, you know, markets and like, the other thing that I was going to mention, this is way back when, was I think if for people who have experience with this, which I think is like, I don't know, 5 people here maybe, I think probably a good analogy of what Kierkegaard is talking about here of the sort of immediate person is Heidegger's conception of a person who's inauthentic, right? An inauthentic person is someone who's just going with the flow of their life. Oh, okay, Hunter, it sounds like you were excited about this. So I think that's my last thought. So I'll drop it and I'll let other people respond.
I thought his comment about, this is on, well, page 40 in the Hong edition. Where is it? Oh, I don't know. It's like deep into the beta necessities despair is the lack possibility. It's before the paragraph, the long paragraph before he starts talking about Philistine bourgeois mentality. So it's in the paragraph where he's talking about the determinist, the fatalist. He says, personhood is a synthesis of possibility and necessity. Its continued existence is like breathing, respiration, which is an inhaling and exhaling. And so, he didn't use the word spirit here, but a lot of you know that spirit in at least the Christian tradition, maybe other religious traditions, I'm not sure, but spirit has to do with breath. Like in the, in the Old Testament, when, you see references to spirit, it has to do with breath. And, you breathe life into things and that sort of thing. And so I'm wondering if he was trying to make a connection there, that there's this inhaling and exhaling between the possible and the necessary. And that, that these modes of despair, one of them, I don't know, maybe necessity would be like holding your breath, and maybe possibility would be like breathing out, but you can't do either one without doing the other, at least if you want to stay alive. And so there's this living dynamic relationship. But the problem is and I don't understand how this would fit into the analogy, but the problem is, unless you rest in the power that created you, in other words, unless you rest in God, we tend to do one of those two things. We tend to either hold our breath, or we tend to exhale and not inhale. We tend to bounce between these polarities, or we try to, within our own power, try to force breathing without there being the sort of natural, I don't know what, organ, diaphragm or something that is doing that naturally. And so, and then, so part of this, I mean, I still get hung up on these things that, that drive logicians absolutely bonkers about continental philosophy, when he says, things like the soul is the soul, except it's not the soul. But that, I think part of the issue is that it's a dynamic, the soul, like this relation relating itself to itself in the relation, it's all relation, or not the soul, but the self is all relation. And it's the way that these two poles are related to one another, and the way they are or are not related to God. And so that whole thing is a churning relation that tends to, and Hunter said fired off or something, but it tends to, when we're trying to do it on our own, it tends to get pushed around. We can't maintain the proper respiration without that divine help. So anyway, that spirit thing helped me. The self is a virtual, oh, here comes Deleuze.
Go ahead, Chase. You've got all our attention. Go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah. Oh no, I lost it. Oh, what the? Now I just have sickness on here. Oh God. Oh, the despair. Oh. But yeah, I mainly wanted to just agree with what Niva just said about the fact that, you know, basically this is kind of like what I was talking about earlier, that because it's a relational self, this is why it's so seemingly paradoxical, because really it is, because it's not a substantial thing. It's not a thing at all. It's a movement and a process, and it's a process of relating to something. So because of that, it has to have some way of going outside of itself. And therefore you have this problem of basically, we have this logic that is very much about trying to talk about things that are like at a freeze frame, just a stop, and talking about things that are simultaneously occurring in space. You know, external divisions with things in space where relations are external, where in time relations can be internal. And that's the big thing. You could have this kind of multiple aspects of something that's existing through time that comes out as different tendencies or different aspects of these poles between, you know, finitude and finite and all that stuff. And that's why I think he's really trying to get us to think more in terms of this relational process rather than this you know, immediacy in the naive sense that he's talking about, of just simply thinking about ourselves as a thing, you know. And mainly I think that would be for something like people that are more on the spectrum towards the despair of the finite, where that's going to be a tendency to think in terms of, you know, static things. But honestly, most of the people I think they're going to read a book like this, maybe I'm just projecting, but it would probably be more the despair of the infinite. Because I mean, at least that section, that resonated with me a lot. You know, getting lost in abstract potentiality and whatnot. So I wonder exactly, you know, he's writing this to try to appeal to people in a lot of ways. But it's kind of interesting that I think this would be a good sort of book to have for people that would think more in terms of, I don't know, maybe, I guess kind of somewhat of both, but also despair of the finite. So I think that should be interesting to see what the meaning of life class thinks of that. You know, I think that there'll probably be some at least philosophy majors in there. I don't know, should be interesting to see what goes on with that. Oh, I see a question here. Would you mind giving examples of what it feels like to get lost in infinitude? Yeah, sure. Oh, well, examples. Oh man.
Well, I mean,
They're
I just
infinite.
for anything, like when, I mean, I have a vague sense, you know, he associates infinitude with the imagination. So, you know, I can think about, you know, getting lost in my imagination in some way. I'm just having a hard time figuring out exactly what that means.
So I have something that I think might be a good example if Chase, you're having trouble thinking of things.
Go for it, Sean. I mean, I could conjure something up, but I'm more curious about what you have to say.
Okay, so this is what I think of when Kierkegaard describes this. So I'm a little bit better about this now, but when I was younger, I always used to like constantly imagine different scenarios or situations or different possibilities and kind of play them out in my head and game them out. And a lot of the times I would never end up doing anything. Like I guess like a very like traditional example, right? I would spend a lot of time thinking about what it would be like to date someone, but never actually ask them out, right? Because I would sort of get lost in conceiving of what that relationship would be like. And it was in a kind of crude and like what I would feel now is kind of gross kind of way. It was a lot more interesting to think about what that relationship would be like than to actually have to deal with actually being in it. And so I think that there's a certain degree of like people who, I think this is, I almost would describe it as like a personality type or a tendency that some people have to just like want to think about possibilities, to want to think about abstract conceptualizations, and almost to sort of be afraid to ever take any actions. Because when you take an action, right, you sort of like collapse the array of possibilities that are available to you, because now you've enacted something into the world, and now you're kind of stuck with the thing that you've enacted, right? That has become a necessity because you've enacted it. So I giving you like, I don't know, more concrete examples that I could possibly, like one thing that I find myself doing a lot, even now, is I play a lot of strategy games. And when I'm playing the strategy games, if it's possible for things to have like diverged at a particular moment, like for me to make a bunch of choices, I almost always make a save of it. And then I will just kind of leave it somewhere and then continue playing the game, and assuming that I'll go back and I'll play that other version, that point where I saved because I was trying to make a decision one way or the other, and then just play out the other version to see what would have happened if I'd made the other choice, right, effectively. And I've gotten better about that in the sense that I hardly ever now like go back and play those saves to go and see how, like, I still do it to kind of satisfy that part of myself that really is like, no, Sean, you have to explore all of the, exactly. Actually, Bourgeois is a beautiful example of this, I think, in the Garden of Forking Paths. Yeah, there's just all this vast array of possibilities, and just being so afraid of collapsing them, so afraid of destroying them, but wanting to kind of like maintain them and keep them in all of their potentiality. That's what I understand Kierkegaard to mean.
Yeah, and I think that sentiment is echoed from last reading under section C of, what is it? Of despair is the sickness unto death. The section is called Despair is the Sickness Unto Death. He says an individual in despair despairs over something, but later he says he's actually despairing over himself, because like you were saying, Sean, one moment. Went blank there for a moment, that's fun. But the closing of possibilities, or if things don't go the way you thought, right? Because he gives the example of either Caesar or nothing, and the man is nothing. He's despairing over the fact that he's not Caesar. That's the something, but it's himself that locked in or lost out on the possible paths. And so I think that's proof of what you just said.
Yeah, I really liked that passage, just because I feel like, that is the problem. It's like every person in some way wants to be someone else. Maybe not like literally be someone else, but wants to, take a characteristic of someone else. But by taking that characteristic, you're throwing yourself away, in a sense, like you're throwing that person who you were away. So if you become that other person, or if you take that characteristic, you're throwing your own characteristic away. But if you remain the way you are, you're kind of ignoring the fact that you wanted to be this other person, which is a part of yourself as well, and so it's this kind of, you're never going to win in a sense, which I can relate to a lot. I also I wasn't here last week, and I guess I read both passages this week, and I just generally kind of wanted to talk a little bit about that, because I used to be a Christian myself, and I guess a few people here have as well. But I think it's really interesting to kind of see Kierkegaard kind of just talk about Christianity in this way. And I feel like the beginning of me kind of leaving Christianity was me kind of trying to reconcile with some of the feelings that I think Kierkegaard is having and talking about. I obviously did it in a very different way, and so it's just interesting to me to kind of see his process of understanding it, and how my process of it, to me, it felt like it required like a sort of rejection of Christianity. I guess I would say that I believe that I don't deserve to go to heaven. I guess that like if there is a hell, then I would prefer to go there because I would feel eternally guilty for being in heaven while certain people are in hell. So that's the way I made sense of it. And I guess that's my general sense of Christianity, is just that, like, if I'm praying to God, there's someone else who is praying to God who doesn't get his prayers answered. I feel like I'm taking that prayer away from him in some sense, you know. And so these are kind of the conceptions I had of Christianity, is that of this sort of balance dialectic, maybe, you know, of like, you know, yeah, just kind of like everything that I get from it is being taken away from someone else, and to recognize that you know, there's sort of this selfishness in having faith. Yeah, exactly. But another thing I want to talk about, which has to do kind of with the immediacy, is I just find it really interesting that he talks about despair as being this process that can happen even if you're unaware of it. And in fact, being unaware of it changes it in some way. It becomes a sort of different type of despair. And I really like this part where he talks about, at the very end of this passage, he says, so he despairs, that is to say, and he's talking about the immediate person, through a strange tergiversation and total mystification concerning himself, he calls it despair. But to despair is to lose the eternal, and of this loss he says nothing. He doesn't dream of it. And then, you know, he says some more, but what he says is in a sense true, only not in the way he understands it. He is turned around, and what he says must be understood backwards. He stands there pointing to something that is not despair, explaining that he is in despair, and yet sure enough, the despair is going on behind him unawares. And I think that, like, when you're a Christian and you try to talk about people who aren't Christians, it's hard to talk about them. It's hard to sort of relate to them and describe their experience, because, you know, you're kind of enveloped in this sort of, in a different world, I would say. And I think Kierkegaard, to me, is like trying to relate to the sort of non-Christian, you know, this maybe a inauthentic Christian, or someone who doesn't, you know, see Christianity in the sense that he does. Yeah, I guess you could say that. I don't really think that the world is like actually perfectly balanced, but I think that the process of asking for something is in itself kind of a sort of taking away from something else. Not to say that the entire world is some sort of zero sum and that everything gets balanced out, but I think that when you ask anyone for something, you're asking them to give something to you, and in a sense you're taking away from them. And to ask God is to kind of create this sort of mediation between you and that other person, and say, like, God, you take from someone else and give it to me, because I don't have the ability to do that, or I don't have the connections that you do, or whatever, you know. And so I think it's sort of like, when I was moving away from Christianity, I saw it as sort of like it was representative of something else, and that's what all of these things were. Like, everything that I saw in Christianity was every symbol represented something else in my experience that I could point to. Yeah. And so, like, my first instinct was, okay, well, rip that away, like take out the symbol, and then we can get to like the actual things that I care about, or the things that I'm thinking about, or the way I think about God. So I'm not saying that God is necessarily that, but I saw him as that. And so that's what he was, you know, because I think that God is whoever, kind of whatever someone sees him as. I think that God sort of represents the self in a lot of ways. And I think that that's what Kierkegaard is trying to say. But yeah, so I don't know. I guess I see this moment where it's like we are all in sort of despair, but we all approach it in different ways, and we can look at it. Yeah, I like when I say things and people put books up to it. No, I really do. I appreciate it. But yeah, I feel like there's this interesting kind of moment of like, we're all in despair, but we kind of have a choice in how we approach it, and whether we point to it directly, or we kind of point the other way. And what is the difference between those two things? I mean, both people have despair. And you know, I mean, if you're pointing the opposite direction, there's kind of this momentum pointing in that direction that implies there's a behind to it, you know? So like, who's to say that pointing the opposite direction isn't the same thing as pointing, you know, towards it? Because in a sense, you know that there's something behind. So you're implying that there's something behind you that is pushing towards that direction. And so, like, I guess I just respect the fact that Kierkegaard is really looking at this and sort of like, how do I approach someone who doesn't think the way I do? How do I, and how do I kind of see myself in them, you know, and what are they doing that isn't as good? You know, it's like, I think that Kierkegaard isn't trying to say that all non-believers are like not correct, you know, and that they're not thinking about the things that I'm thinking about and I'm better than them. You know, he's just saying, look, we're approaching the situation differently, but we all have it. And we kind of have a choice in whether we see it as a good thing or a bad thing. And whether we are going to point directly at it or point the other way, and what's the difference between those two things, you know? And so like, yeah, I think that talking about this sort of immediate person who's in worldly affairs and, you know, but I think he has respect for that, you know, and I don't think he's trying to kind of say that I don't know what's happening in the chat. I'm just, yeah, I think that he has some respect for it, and he's really trying to kind of understand the perspective and see, you know, like what is this to them, and what are they pointing at that I am missing by me focusing so much on the despair, making it a sort of intellectual pursuit, making it about Christianity. You know, it's like, to me, this intellectuality and the Christianity are like limiting factors. But, you know, I mean, anyone could see them as opportunities to expand our understanding of it, you know? And so, yeah, I guess I just think that in my own perspective, in my own experience with Christianity, I always saw it as a limiting factor, you know, and I think Kierkegaard sees it as an expanding factor, but he also like wants to understand the reason someone would think of it as a limiting factor. And I don't think like Kierkegaard and I are very far apart in terms of our understandings of Christianity, you know, and so, yeah, that's it.
He, you know, that his comments about pagans and, you know, great pagan people, you know, who have a wonderful aesthetic, but who lack, I forgot what exactly he said. I don't remember if he said they lack spirit, but I mean, I think he is, I think he really does believe that faith in God as he conceives of God is a way out of despair, and it is the only way out of despair. And again, because like, you know, when he says pagans didn't have this available to them, and they kind of did everything they possibly could, but they couldn't get to that last step because they didn't have that available to them. So yeah, and I think, you know, I get the impression that he does think that the way out of despair, I mean, he explicitly says this actually in a few places, where the way out of despair is to rest transparently in, you know, the power that created you. So, but that's only available to people who are, you know, who understand that that's what's going on. The unsettling thing, which, and he may not, I mentioned this before last week, I think he may not even address this here, but the vague sense I have from his book Repetition and other things is that even that, you know, like say you once rest in the divine, it's not like, okay, now I'm done, now I'm good for my life. It's like, no, you keep having to do that. And so it's like this, sounds like it's a constant, I don't know if battle's the right word, but some sort of constant thing you have to do to keep doing that. You know, maybe again, it has to do with this dynamism of the soul or of the self, that because it's a dynamic process, it's always shifting and moving, and you keep having to return to that grounding in God. But it sounds like, you know, like it's like these other modes of despair that would take you away from God are always just not even lurking in the background. They're just always there, like getting distracted. I get distracted by this, or I get distracted by that, or so that you kind of, even if you make this breakthrough and achieve this state of rest, you just keep having to go back to it over and over and over.
So I think one way to kind of conceive of God that would make sense with that, with the way that the self is this process of becoming and whatnot, in a way that is itself a kind of synthesis of opposites. If you see God as the kind of absolute, by the way that it's able to generate relativity kind of internally within itself, that it's kind of what stabilizes all the different relative processes and whatnot, and the relations, as a kind of I'm going to try really hard not to use any Kantian terms, but basically like the transcendental conditions of, well, now I'm doing it, but the transcendental conditions of the self as a relation, basically what makes it possible that the relation is relating to itself and that everything is composed of relations, would be some kind of absolute that would ground relations themselves. So I think if you think of God like that, it makes some sense that God is something that could be related to by that relation itself. Does that make any sense at all? I don't even, yeah.
It makes sense to me, but I don't understand why. I mean, I'm not sure this is what you're saying, that it kind of makes sense that if the self is a constant dynamism, there's got to be something outside the self to sort of grab onto and give it stability. Like if the self is well, I don't know. I was thinking of a bad analogy, but in that sort of sense, is that kind of what you mean?
Yeah. It's kind of like, Schelling talked about the Ungrund, the non-ground that is really kind of the ground for existence. That in order for something to exist, it can't just spring out of nowhere, and all by itself and whatnot. It has to, come from somewhere. So every existent has to have a ground in something, but then every ground has to, in some way, contrast with what it produces. The process is different from the product that the process produces. In the same way, I think that's the difference between God and the different relations that God sort of produces, I guess. So I think that's kind of what he's talking about. One thing that made me think of this is I saw an article that was talking about Plotinus's idea of God, and I haven't read it at all. I just read the title, but it's actually made quite an impact, I think, on the way that I think of God, at least in the sense. So it was basically saying that Plotinus's idea of the one, of is basically God, is itself like pure relation. So it's basically, the one that can ground those things would be something that is pure relation. But in that sense, it would be absolute itself. Hopefully, does that make any sense? It does to me. I don't know. Kind of.
That's what matters.
Thank you, Travis. Thank you.
I just commented that he does say that that the devil is pure spirit. So I guess the devil's like a pure. I guess that makes me wonder, what does that mean in terms of those, the finite and the infinite? Does that matter? Does it mean that, I don't know. But anyway.
I mean, that would make sense with Augustine, right? Because if we're saying, this is me just swinging in out of left field, sorry, but right, if God is ultimately like an undergirding, like sort of infinite reality, right? For Saint Augustine, right? Like the total absence of God, right, which you can almost think of as like a point, right, would be the closest thing you could get to an opposite. Sorry, I also cut you off, but that was my attempt to give you an example of why that.
Yeah, I didn't have much more to say. I'm remembering I used to belong to this many years ago, a group that was into Christian contemplation, Christian mysticism, and one of the people we read, I've forgotten who it was, just said that the Trinity, just trying to describe the Trinity, it was that the Holy Spirit is the kiss between the Father and the Son. And and trying to I mean, it sounds sort of dialectical actually, but trying to understand God as pure relation is, well, it does sound dialectical. You've got Father and Son, and then you've got this relation between them. So anyway, I'm kind of foundering here.
I'm gonna try to find that Plotinus article. I think if you can just see the title, it would help in the way that it helped me. I have faith in that. I'm gonna take a leap of faith in that idea and try to find this article.
I'm gonna have to go here in a few minutes, but I did want to throw out a couple things before I have to go. And it's just a couple connections to other texts. Those of us who read the Ages of the World, I'm sure you're already picking up. There's echoes, reverberations. The dynamism, the potentialities become principles. The infinite and the finitude. So just that dynamic relation between the two. I feel that Schelling's work did work on Kierkegaard. It provides a lot of the background there to his worldview. And then a relation, and now I'm going to draw another relation. It kind of relates to actually something Sean brought up earlier. He pointed out Kierkegaard's focus on individuality, and then said it's not exactly a Marxist critique of individuality. So, but he doesn't take in other souls or anything. So, what exactly is he going on about when he critiques the bourgeois? In my translation, it's petit bourgeois, the petit bourgeois attitude. And for me, when I read it, I knew exactly what he was talking about, or I felt I knew exactly what he was talking about. And it's this the sense of the individual who feels that he's self-sustaining, like fully self-sustaining, and it's runs in the face of Kierkegaard, because no individual is ever fully self-sustaining. And if you want to escape despair, you have to situate yourself transparently in the force which created you, which is God. You can never become a fully self-sustaining, coherent, integrated subject. But that's one of the myths, or the ideology of the petit bourgeois. And so the point, the connection I was going to make was to the other text we're reading on Mondays is Ulysses. So those of you guys who are reading Ulysses, you'll see this line, and I may not be quoting it exactly verbatim, word for word, but the character Haynes says something out loud. He says, "I paid my own way," or maybe Daedalus was kind of like criticizing Haynes. The way it comes across is this: it's the boast of the Englishman. I paid my own way. And here we have a perspective of Joyce, the Irish colonized, looking at this person who's like, "Oh yeah, I paid my own way." Clearly you do not. You're part of the colonizer. You live off of the exploitation of your colonies. You didn't pay. You are not nearly as coherent, integral, self-sustaining, self-enclosed, and fully responsible for your own achievements as you think you are. And that to me speaks to the petit bourgeois ideology that Kierkegaard is attacking here, and that Joyce is having a sly dig at in the character of Haynes in Ulysses.
That idea that you just brought about being self-efficient reminds me a lot of when I read some anarchist work, especially Kropotkin, talking about mutualism and mutual aid. Yeah, some thumbs up there. Where it says that no matter who you are, you're never self-efficient because, number one, history, all invention every single human being, countless thousands, millions even, have brought about this point of society where we are now. You know, if Gilgamesh hadn't begun planting grains, you know, where would we be? And then, of course, God, with Kierkegaard and that despair that you feel. So I just wanted to make the connection between the anarchist and I guess he sort of did that because Marx's analysis. That's all.
If I can jump on that real quick, because I do think one interesting thing about that, in the way that I think that Travis kind of already made this point, but I want to belabor it because I think it's interesting. Because the way that like the Marxist or the communist or the anarchist or the anarchistic or anarcho-communist or whoever we're identifying here, like conceptualizes that as different from the way that the Christian does. And it seems to me that rather than conceptualizing it into the abstract idea of the community, right? Like the community of all humanity, or to the individual community commune that we're participating in. What the Christian is wanting to say is, rather than thinking about it like that, like about your relationship with other people, we want to conceptualize it in terms of your relationship with God, that God is the one who comes down and like connects you with the rest of the world. And so that was what the pump house thing was about. So a while ago, this was, I think, while I was still in undergrad, a storm came through and blew away the little shack, the pump house that the pump for the well on my mom's farm sits in. And my mom was like, I have no clue how we're going to get the money for this. Or I guess telling you about our financial situation, right? Like, you know, basically like all credit cards are maxed out. All loans are taken. The house is already mortgaged. Like, there's no way that it's not like it's that expensive to build a little shack to put over your pump house, but it costs some money. And we were like, how the heck are we going to get that money? And my mom went and asked her local church, right? And the church just fronted the money for it. And they, you know, and it wasn't even like a loan or anything. They just, you know, they gave her the money and she built the shack and it was built, right? And I mean, that might have happened differently in different kinds of communities, like probably, you know, like 20, 30 years ago in the community that she was in, you know, probably her neighbors would have come and built the shack for her rather than giving but it's still the same idea that you don't go and you ask the community, you go and you ask God, but you kind of ask God in earshot of the community, and then the community comes in and does the thing, right? But there's this weird like displacement that has to happen. And I mean, I guess this is me like critiquing Christianity, because I personally think this is a bad way to approach the world, but I can kind of see why they want to put it that way, because like for all sorts of like Kantian reasons, right? Like we don't want to be, oh, I'm stepping up and I'm being the good person and doing the good thing, because then there's like this kind of moralization that goes on that like you shouldn't think so highly of yourself and blah, 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 blah. But it is weird because it does make it continue to be like an individual relation. Like now it's not about your relationship with other people, or like dealing with your despair in terms of how it is that you relate to others and how it is that you exist in a community, and how that both gives you possibilities and potential or limits them. But now it's all about how you have this singular relationship with God, and God facilitates infinite possibility, which is weird, and it's a radically different way of thinking about things. But then a lot of us are in the weird situation where, because we grew up in communities that think like that, we're kind of like having to mesh out, well, how much of that do I buy, and how much of that is a problem, and how much of that is analogous to these ways of communitarian thinking, if that makes sense.
Yeah, to provide some anecdotal evidence, which is, you know, always good, I think, you know. I just when I was in church, I was in like a student sort of youth group, and I was really close friends with like this group of people that was like pretty old, like older than me, like a few years older than me. So they ended up graduating high school and going to college, and basically left the church, and basically I remember having this experience where like I would go to church camps and I would, you know, feel the presence of God. Like I really did kind of sort of have this connection, and I really believed in it. And they left, and I stopped feeling that. And I was around people, I you know, and I was still doing all the same things, but I just kind of didn't feel like these were people that I was close to, and that connection with God kind of disappeared along with them leaving. And so I just had a, like, I think one of my earlier kind of questioning thoughts about Christianity was just, is God like just other people? Is God just like my friends? Is that what I, you know, and I'm just kind of replacing them with this idea of God, and making all these kind of other assumptions that kind of ignore them as people, and, you know, as individuals, you know, and so I saw that as a problem, and, you know, kind of distance myself from it. But at the same time, like, you know, I'm able to look back now and, you know, question kind of like, was that a problem, you know, or was my problem with it just that, you know, they were gone, you know, and that I felt like I had to do something about that, and me kind of separating from God was my reaction to them separating from me, you know. And so, yeah, I don't know. I think that obviously God represented more than that to me, but I think that that was a huge part. And yeah, and so like, again, I think with what Hunter says about mediation, it's like, I'm inclined to question, did I take the mediator out, or did I just like cut off one mediation and then all the other mediations still exist? You know, it's like, to what extent did I really like remove the mediator, and am I truly looking at people's selves now? You know, I have to question that. But, you know, I think that at least the one thing that I can say it did was allow me to sort of think about the things that I was experiencing in a different way. You know, so I do think that sort of questioning your relationship to God and questioning that sort of Christianity is like an important aspect, but I don't think totally rejecting it is necessarily the answer. So yeah. Okay, more books to read.
Just throw at the screen. Let's do. Oh, today I bought this. Travis, you really beautifully illustrated some points in your talking, and one of them is that, like, you were like, oh yeah, the mediation thing. Like when you, it's not. I think it's even like you're more right than I think you're giving yourself credit. Like I think, because it's like, yeah, not only is it like, yeah, you just remove one set of one mediator from the set of mediators in the line of mediation, and then it's just more mediation all the way down. But I think at the same time, it's like, once you remove that mediator, like there's this mediator that kind of gets you to circle around the idea of God through this, like, oh yeah, I'm hanging out with my friends, and we were a teenager, but I was gonna say, like, we're drinking beer and smoking doobers or whatever, and like, you know, like, Christianity's cool, and I love it. But when that goes away, it's like, oh, it's this utter despair. Yeah, skate church. I think I think that once it's like, oh yeah, you would, okay, if you were like a hardcore Christian, you might have this sense of like, okay, once these teenagers who are all into drinking, well, actually, I get, you know, cream sodas at the tuba parties at Cedar Park. Sorry, that's a reference for Travis. These people who are kind of straying away from God, like it's fun, you know, it's a fun time, and we're these young hip youth pastors and whatever. If you're a hardcore Christian, like if you're in that position and if you're like subject to that, you would say, okay, get rid of all that. I just want God. I want Jesus. I want straight up God. And then it kind of loses its luster, not only in the sense that you don't get to, you know, smoke doobers or whatever, but also that like the feeling and whatever reality that we can assign to the experience of godliness or Christendom, whatever reality that we can assign to those experiences, being the transcendent feelings or your connection to the concept of God, or your habituation of Christly practices, all of the reality of Christianity and the experience of being a Christian, it disappears. The reality of being a Christian and like God and your relationship to God. It's like Chase said, it's this thing that we go around in this elliptical, and the only way that we can get to it is if my friends tell me that, like in my old, I could just keep making references about how dumb teenagers are, but let's talk about how dumb old people are. I would totally buy in if you my friends were like, hey, let's all show up at a building once a week and eat donuts and then listen to a guy, and then sing a couple songs and then go out, eat some more donuts and then go home and watch some football. I'm like, yeah, that sounds great. I would be super compelled. I'd be so interested. But yeah, no. But once that like disappears, not only is the compelling factor, the actual material, like you get donuts and you get to meet your friends, like that's fun. That's all fun and good. But with that comes the entire reality of being a Christian and of having any relationship to God whatsoever, and of conceiving of these problems and taking leaps of faith, and of being, and it's put it in Kierkegaardian terms, being connected to infinite consciousness of self. Connection, whatever connection that might be, to the infinite consciousness of self and to the infinity and to God. That connection is only possible through contingent, material, weird little like gifts, that keep you. And that's okay. A good example. And now this is way less appealing than youth church stuff and coffee and donuts. But I'm serious. The same job or role that is played by coffee and donuts and friendship that pulls us into Christianity, at the same role that is played by the physical corpse of Christ, by like the material physical body of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, his flesh and sinew that we did what we did to, it serves the same function. It is the material contingent remainder of our connection to an infinite consciousness. And it's a necessary part of the equation, and once you remove it, you don't get an unmediated, let's get rid of the material contingent. Let's just get rid of that. Let's just focus on the direct access. You can't get rid of the contingent little stupid inconsistencies and material little incentives and goodies and brr, brr, brr. Oh, what the hell is dude? I crucified Christ. Basically, I just think connection to the infinite consciousness of self or whatever is, I don't think that it's like being overwhelmed with an immediate infinite consciousness of yourself, but I think that it's connection to infinite consciousness of self. And I think that infinite consciousness of self is something like total consciousness of self. And total consciousness of self would be transparent, sitting in God, in the thing that grounds you. I think that's what he would. I
just don't understand what the word infinite does there. Like infinite consciousness of self. What does that mean? Does it mean like absolute conscious transparency to where I'm absolutely, completely aware of everything that's, I just literally don't know what work is that word infinite doing there?
Well, I don't know. I frankly, my reading, my like immediate, just sort of like whatever reading of what he's trying to say is that, well, okay, by the way, just to reference something in the chat, everybody's saying that I'm against Protestants. I need to settle my score with Catholics first, and then then the day of reckoning will come. But so I think that the infinite consciousness of self is kind of this like, I think that for Kierkegaard, if he were to describe a state, like the state of infinite consciousness of self, it would be like that freedom from despair. I think because that's taking the self not just as like, because he describes earlier in the text, he talked all about how you have all the time in the world and all the possibility and the potentiality in the world. What is it? Possibilities despair is a lack of necessity. And a part of that I really related to, that possibilities despair is a lack of necessity. Chase, it's funny that you said that you really related to it, because I related to it in a separate way, because I thought about how it made me think about possibilities despair. It made me think about this getting lost in this infinitude. and the infinity that is inside of myself. This is a Lacanian formula that says, or actually, honestly, it goes back to Hegel. There's a Hegelian phrase that is the secrets of the ancient Egyptians were also the secrets for the Egyptians themselves. And I really do think that that's important, because when you look at me, I am a big question mark. I'm a nebula. I'm a secret. I have all kinds of dirty little secrets that you don't get to see. And I could be picturing you naked right now, but and you don't get to know. But or better yet, in a more realistic way, I could have desires and wants from you. I want things from you, and you don't get to know what those are. But and the problem is the part where this all gets really twisted around is that I don't know what I want from you either. When you look at me and you see me as this big mysterious thing that's all mystifying and interesting, I am also perplexed at myself. I am like, yeah, it's a mystery, right? I don't get it either. I don't know what to do. It's just the secrets of me as the Egyptians, the secrets of the Egyptians are also the secrets for the Egyptians themselves. I see it as this, and this Kierkegaard talking about the infinite, the despair of the possibility. I have infinite capacity to look inside myself and find problems with myself, or affectations, or parts of my unconscious drives, or the multitude, the plenitude of my consciousness, or my experience, or my unconsciousness, or whatever. I could pick apart every little thing and say, I need to spend the next 72 hours thinking about this memory that I had of me being like a teenager, and like farting in class and being guilty about that. And why do I feel guilt about that? And well, why do I feel guilt about it right now? Well, why am I asking myself this? Why am I so neurotic and stupid that I'm thinking about memories from years ago? And I can just I have an infinite capacity to waste my own time. I am infinitely capable of wasting my time and burrowing myself down into a deep hole of despair that never ends. And I think that's something like the infinite possibility, or the possibilities despair. But I think that infinite consciousness of self is something different. I think that it's the phrase consciousness of self. I think infinite, when he says the phrase infinite, I am, and maybe this is me misreading it or just kind of filling in blanks because I'm not actually getting what he's saying, but I read it as just like a complete consciousness of self, total, full, absolute consciousness of self, even, just total consciousness of self, absolute consciousness of self. And I assumed, I'm realizing now it was an assumption, I assumed that infinite consciousness of self was referring to, was referring to that position of the end of despair, of positioning myself in transparency into the arms or whatever of the thing that grounds me. I think that's what. But then I think that, and now I was told in the chat that there's some translation discrepancies in my version of the text versus everybody else's version of the text. But when he says, here there is no infinite consciousness of the self, that's where he says that. That's where he says there is no infinite consciousness of self, when he's talking about the despair over earthly who's its and what's its. I think, at least is from my reading, it's like, no, duh, there's no infinite consciousness of the self. No, like of course there's no infinite consciousness of the self in this guy, in this ho-hum dude who's just trying to live life. But I think that he's kind of saying more in that sentence, perhaps. And I'm going to look at the other translation in a second here and make sure. But I think it's not just that there is no infinite consciousness of the self, but there's not even like a connection or a pull towards infinite consciousness of self. There's not even like a brush with an infinite consciousness of self, there's not even sort of like any I guess powerful potency or capacity, or like there's this or basically. And I think, but Sean is right. There is a potency. Yes, I know. So listen, Sean, I'm going to give you your treat here. You were correct. All right. There is, of course, in each person a capacity for infinity, because that's what a person is infinity, infinitude. But I think Kierkegaard is just saying, like, it's been so whittled down and castrated and shoved into a box and compartmentalized and put into the back of my mind or whatever, that it is like withered and atrophied. Like, maybe he would say that this person, this immediate person, is experienced an atrophy in their faculties that give them like the actions that are required to gain contact with infinite consciousness of self. Their muscles that they need to flex in order to do the actions that they need to do in order to gain infinite consciousness of self, those muscles have atrophied, I think. I guess that's, I don't know.
If I can give a really dumb analogy, because that's all I'm aiming to do these days. You know how if you have like so it works this way in my bathroom. So if y'all really need, I mean, my bathroom is gross, but I can show you an example of this. So you have like one mirror, and then you have another mirror, and if you have them at the right angle, they can't see each other. And then like as you get them closer and closer together, you get like reflections, and then reflections of reflections, and then reflections of reflections of reflections of reflections of reflections, and it just, so it's like you can make it as close or as far away. Oh my gosh, we'll have to read the Chase thing.
Stop it, Chase. That's a bad habit of yours at this point. Stop it.
But yeah, so I think that like this muscle.
I can't help myself. I'm sorry. I know it's bad. Yeah, but I had the same. I was thinking the same exact thing, Sean. That's what I was trying to show. That I wrote it down here. But finish your point, and then I'll quote my thing to show. Yeah,
I love it. Yes, this is perfect. But yeah, I'm literally imagining that muscle is like basically a thing that can kind of pull that mirror in, so that you can increase the degrees of reflection that are occurring and how rapidly they're occurring, and then but you could push it back. And so this person is just, they can't move their mirror. It only allows like, maybe you can barely see the tip of the other mirror in it, like just barely, but you can. There's virtually no reflection going on. And then with the infinite possibility, we're approaching someone who's just shoved the one mirror up against the other mirror. There's just like infinite reflection going on. Go for it, Chase.
Yeah. So, okay, the self as this, relational process. Okay, what does it mean I think a mirror is a good example of that idea of something inherently being composed of a relation. Is the mirror reflects, also a very good symbol of consciousness in the sense of something reflecting. So he's saying the self is self-consciousness, essentially. It's the reflective capacity. Well then, okay, a mirror that reflects another mirror, that seems like a pretty good symbol for that relation relating to itself. And then you get the infinite regress. So also because of that, you can't just focus on just one thing, just, oh, there it is, the mirror, and you just possess it. No, the mirror is always something that's going to be referring to itself. If it refers to itself, it refers to something outside of itself, because it's inherently reflecting something other than itself, outside of itself. So that's why he's also talking about this idea of, becoming must be an infinite moving away from itself, in the infantizing of the self. That's a great word, infantizing. So that's what I was thinking of, also in the sense of, and then the other aspect that, and an infinite coming back to itself in the finitizing process. Yeah, there you go. Okay, so I was thinking about that, and then the way also that there's other things that kind of reflect this aspect of not just a mirror, but also something like language, and the way that it's talked about in structural linguistics, where they say, okay, cat, there's nothing inherent about the word cat where it's referring to, the furry thing that's on my bed somewhere. Instead, it gets its meaning by, our relation to every other word in the English language, essentially. So I was thinking about that in the sense that I think he's talking about something like that it exists by way of relation. So that's what I was thinking of when I was when I wrote this, and I thought, okay, this is another example yet again of, you know, the mirror reflecting the mirror in this infinite regress, which apparently it's considered a like a literary trope called I don't know how to say the French, but it basically translates to like the abyss in scene, abîmé en scene, something like that. Okay, that's, yeah, my French is awesome. But it's like a literary trope that Derrida actually talked about. He wrote something about it. But oh yeah, so okay. I keep wanting to read this, but I feel like I have to have almost like an infinite sort of I need to like set it up, you know, in order, so it's not just like, oh, what the hell does that mean? Infinite relation to self, you know, what the hell? So I was also thinking the idea that do you guys know who Douglas Hofstadter is? I think that's his name. He's kind of like analytic philosophy, sort of, I think. But he has this idea of the self as a strange loop. He talks about like meta-referential stuff. And I think that's a really good description of basically what is going on with, you know, the nature of consciousness itself. Even if you think of it in the sense of like, you know, in phenomenologies, even like Husserl, we get the idea of intentionality. You know, consciousness is intentionality. Yeah, yeah. I have his other book, the Metamagical Dilemmas or something like that. Anyways, so I think that's a very good description of, you know, the way that the self is inherently reflecting something. Intentionality, it's always intending, kind of reaching out towards something outside of itself. Therefore, it's really a process that's constantly reflecting something else. And so let's see, I'm just going to read this now and see what happens with it. Okay. The inherent paradox of the self-conscious self as a strange loop, which is an infinite regress in the French term, the abyss in self, which is basically the mirrors reflecting the mirrors in this kind of infinite regress of a relational process relating to itself. Singular but multiple, metastable, which means basically something that's actually in a process, in motion, but is relatively stable, which is itself via the process of differing from itself. So you see, just like the mirror, it has to be itself by differing from itself, in the same way that, you know, he's saying the progress of the becoming must be an infinite moving away from itself. You know, and then the Bertrand Russell is just like, what does that mean? You know, it has to move away from itself. Then it can't. That's not itself. Well, fuck you, Bertrand Russell. That's what I say. Okay, I think I'm done. So I'm like in a really silly mood today. I apologize.
I like it.
So this is maybe too obscure a question, but you know, when you were talking about consciousness, well, we just talked about the whole reflection thing. I don't know, maybe this is too far afield, but, you know, I'm thinking vaguely informed or inspired by Sartre. I think of consciousness kind of as, you know, like you said, it is, well, maybe I'm thinking about intentionality, but consciousness is fundamentally reflective, or it, you know, consciousness is the taking in of what's out there. And so, and you know, like I'm thinking in terms of intentionality, consciousness is this openness to the world, and it takes the world in, or it reflects the world. But then when, you know, Kierkegaard's talking about this, like an internal reflection, I'm having a hard time figuring out how to, maybe they can't be put together, But Kierkegaard seems more interested in this reflective capacity as turned on itself, or as, I guess maybe that's essentially what consciousness is this reflective capacity turned on itself. And I'm just wondering what for Kierkegaard, probably someone's written a dissertation on this, but how does something like intentionality fit in? Maybe that's too far afield anyway. It's just a question that came up when you were talking about consciousness as fundamentally reflective.
Yeah, I see them as pretty similar components of each other. I would say that intentionality has that. I mean, I think Husserl saw intentionality as the essence of consciousness for a reason, because consciousness, has that capacity of, and that is its reflection in a lot of ways, is that it's not something, just stuck in and inherent in itself. It's not a thing. Instead, it's this process of being able to actually take in something, relate to something without actually, like physically, in a sense, taking it in the way that we would in terms of a very, linear type of way of seeing that. And that, that's why it's so difficult to talk about something like, being aware of something, in my mind, I'm perceiving things, but yet all this stuff is happening, in my head, in my brain. And then there's like that paradox too of like, well, how does that happen, And it's because we're like kind of evaluating it with this kind of, okay, consciousness is something that can like take something from the environment and put it inside of, something different yet that is in the environment, in a brain, and then reproduce that in a sense. That's a very strange sort of nature that can't actually be really understood in terms of the way that we would talk about, basic like Newtonian physics and things like that. And that's why it has this strange component where it's so unlike most things. I think this is why Lacan and all these people, they see that there is this like just like a paradoxical like sinkhole in reality when it comes to subjectivity. And it's even weirder because it's not something that's like, oh, it's just simply totally hidden, but no, it's actually, like Merleau-Ponty says, actually you can kind of see consciousness in a way. You kind of see subjectivity, but never in this direct manner. But it adds this like surreal depth to things where you can always kind of like get a hint at it, but like that, say immediacy in the Hegelian sense, you can never actually fully get to it. I could never actually like possess the consciousness of another. I can never actually know what Nevitt's cat is experiencing and thinking. In the same way, I don't even really know the total depth of my own experience. But yeah, I think this book is really just kind of saying like, I don't know, it's weird to be a person, which is, yeah, I think we could write like a lot of books and have a lot of seminars just on that. Stuff is weird, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the word correctly, but when Kant uses the word apperception, at least I think one meaning of it is just being aware that you're aware, or consciousness being aware of its awareness. Well, maybe being aware that it is aware. And so maybe that, I don't know, maybe there's sort of, maybe Kierkegaard's kind of working on that. What does that mean for consciousness to be aware of awareness or aware of itself? So you guys are going ape shit, so I think it's time to quit.
I've got Kant's whole categorical system here that I'm showing you guys. You just read it real quick. Yeah. But it talks about how apperception works and whatnot. Yeah. I should show you guys like a whole book just through the screen here. Yeah. It's great. Oh, now I actually have to go talk about Kant in an hour with my professor who's like a genius who I'm too stupid to understand when he talks about Kant. So yeah, it should be fun.
Good luck.
Yeah, it's just like, oh, I love this argument in the second analogy of experience. Like, it's so fun. Like, we're gonna have a lot of fun talking about this, guys. Like, oh my God. Like, oh. Kant is a horrible, horrible writer. Yeah.
He's objectively the worst. Yes, he's the smartest person I hate to read.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I don't doubt his genius at all. Not at all. But God damn it, Kant, it's just awful. Awful. Yeah.
My graduate advisor told me that the reason that the French write so badly, French existentialists and so on, is because they were trying to copy Germans. They're trying to copy those damn Germans.
A thing I had heard, and if this is true, I really like this, but that in fact, before there was this big contact between German and French intellectual thinkers, French intellectuals were actually known for the clarity and precision of their writing. Like the French language was associated with being very clear and very easy to understand, which is hilarious.
Maybe
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
a bit of that in like Montaigne, because if I have a selection of his essays and like all of them are like, oh, now it's me showing a book at the screen, but like they're all pretty clear and precise. So I can never forgive the Germans and their influence on the world. I think that's the outcome. Yeah.
My one inadequate German course, the woman who taught it said that there was this period in German intellectual history, maybe it's still true, I don't know, but where there was sort of a machismo thing going on, where they actually intentionally constructed very difficult sentences because, German is partially inflected. And so you can create these nested structures that you kind of have to unpack, and that it was a sign of intellectual power to be able to construct these, complex, difficult paragraphs. And then the poor translators have to come and figure out how to unwind all that stuff and put it into English. And so apparently that's one reason why some of this stuff is, they're like, I'm a German intellectual.
Though it's not all necessarily the German language's fault, but a lot of this actually is sort of dependent on the Germans themselves, some of them, Hegel, in the sense that it's very possible to write clear philosophy in German. Schopenhauer is a very clear writer. You can maybe question some of the depth, maybe, but Schopenhauer is a really good writer. I encourage anyone, like he writes really clear. It's almost like, okay, if Kant was able to write properly, he would sound like Schopenhauer. It's really interesting. And so Nietzsche, I think he was a really good writer, just in terms of his prose and whatnot, and Schopenhauer too. So I think it's possible to write philosophy in German clearly in the same way it used to be for French too. But yeah, now we're just totally screwed at this point. I think I can't even write in English clear anymore, because I've been just corrupted by all this like German and French stuff where I can't even like speak clearly and coherently anymore. Yeah. Thanks.
I was in a reading group that died after a few sessions, but we were beginning to read some of what Heidegger wrote about Kant, and it was some of the clearest philosophical prose I've ever read. And it was Heidegger. So
the same way, if you read a lot of Deleuze's stuff where he writes about other philosophers, it's actually pretty clear. Like his book on Nietzsche, very clear.
His book on Spinoza is super
repetition?
clear.
No, yeah.
It's really weird to me because it's like I almost think it's better to get introduced to a lot of these writers like Deleuze and like Heidegger by reading their like ancillary stuff first, because they'll talk about their philosophical ideas, but they'll do it in a way that like isn't absolutely impossible to read.
Yeah, I totally agree. Especially, like Heidegger, reading his lecture material, like his course material, it's actually understandable in the same way. So even then, so Deleuze, he had like some interviews, I think they were like, and dialogues that, he's talking like a regular person, and he's saying, yeah, things don't exist, and then very clear. But then I can kind of understand, why ultimately, wait, why is Joey gross?
Food was falling out of his mouth while he was eating.
Oh, I see. Yeah, that's why. I told my mom. Yeah, I'm cool. I still live with my mom. Yeah. That I can't be eating during these seminars. Like, that's disgusting. But then Joey's just, look at him. Yeah. What is that? That looks good.
Okay, so I'm gonna say two things. First off, me hungry. Second off, yeah. Oh, second off, so I've been saying that to inform you all that me hungry, and therefore me want to go to Chipotle and get food. So we're gonna do that. We're all gonna I've decided that we're gonna end this.
No, you need to read this. Look at this first.
Look at this. Oh, it's a CD that I have on my desk. Oh, look at this.
It looks like the periodic table that
Look
you're
at
holding
this.
up
Look
there.
at this. Look at
It
it.
looks like is that beryllium? Is that plutonium? Is that carbon?
It's
No, I don't deal with that bullshit.
Contium. That Joey, that looks delish. If I'm being honest, you're getting me all hungry.
It's all about the humors, the four humors. There's none of this
Oh,
dumb
yeah,
elementalism.
yeah.
shit.
All those humors are present in Joey's food. Ooh, that looks good too.
All I need is the four humors, all of medicine,
Oh my
That's
God, there's a
it.
cat.
and also the four classical elements. Everything else is bullshit. Just get rid of it. Throw in the fire. Yeah,
And
Yes.
Pluto is not a planet.
yeah, I agree.
I agree. I agree with
Well,
that.
I mean,
Yeah,
I doubt that Earth is a planet. Look, so
Yeah.
Honestly, I think the whole category
doubt
of planet is
planets.
dumb, and we
Yeah.
should get rid of them.
it's outdated and it's binary and it's arborescent and it's oppressive and
Very
okay.
arborescent. Yeah.
One thing that I just want to say about the language thing is that Hegel made a point in the preface to Phenomenology of Spirit. He says, usually in the preface of philosophy books, you like to write what you're about to say in a short sort of thing. It's sort of clear. And he said, I'm not going to do that because that would defeat the whole point. This took like a lot of effort to figure out, and it's going to take a lot of effort to understand. And if you want to just kind of read like he said, if I put the summary in the preface, you're just going to read the preface and then put the rest down because it's hard and it's stupid and it sucks and it's boring. But that's life. We live in a horrible, terrible, boring, sucky reality where you have to sit and headbutt a book for years until you can understand it. And that's why that's him justifying his complex writing. He's like, you have to write in this complex way. It's supposed to be kind of inaccessible. All right.
Hegel's actually, in his lecture courses, he's also pretty clear too. I read some like 50 something pages of his the history of philosophy the other day. I read this section about Socrates, and it was actually pretty clear. Like he still talks like the infinite and whatnot, but it's pretty clear. I liked it. It was good stuff.
Yeah, I think that like the obfuscation that's present in his text is kind of intentional. I think that he's really like, well, whatever. Now I'm like sincerely kind of talking about Hegel. Don't pull me back in. Stop it. You know just how to pull me in.
We were allowing people to escape to go to Chipotle.
Good. All right.
Yeah.
Gotta go.
Okay.
Me hungry.
Okay.
Me hungry. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Enjoy Chipotle.
I am fucking
Auf Wiedersehen.
going. I got a gift card from my
So long.
mom. I'm gonna buy. Okay. Bye.
Bye.